title which brings the two areas of work in my life together into the one space. So sound, as I see it, it's also a play on words because you don't see sound in that normal sense. But of course, when we're looking at being a visual artist and a composer, and because of my interest in how sound can influence my visual art and my visual art can influence sound, there is a direct connection between sound as I see it. So in that context, I think it sums up both of these things in the one world.
Well, I was surprised to find that you weren't trained that you didn't come to music with any kind of knowledge in a way. You weren't a trained composer and you weren't a trained player, and yet you didn't even dabble with a guitar or piano or anything. You came at it with literally the blank canvas in every sense of the word.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it was all driven by a passion and a love of music. And
but how old were you at this time when you suddenly...
it would have been my early teens. I mean, when I went to primary school, we used to have at assembly, they used to play a bit of a Mozart horn concerto and a bit of a march from Aida and things like that. And even then, this music, I had a reaction to this music. It did something. I didn't know what it was. I was very young, but I liked it. And as I sort of got into my teens, that like developed into a passion. And I had a pretty grim upbringing in many ways. And music was a sort of refuge, somewhere I could put myself, a different world, a much nicer world to be in. But as opposed to just being a consumer of it, it actually went the other way, and I started to get these feelings that I wanted to make it, this magical stuff that music is. I wanted to create it for myself, but of course I had absolutely no idea how to go about that. So it took many years and much frustration to actually teach myself how to read and write.
Well, it's interesting that you didn't take a formal online course or anything on stage and notation. You just sort of went about it in your own way.
There was no online when I was doing that, of course. This is in the 1970s. There was nothing. No, there were no courses. I was in such an isolated place, I suppose, that I had no idea about courses or training. I knew people could read and write music, and people could play instruments, but I didn't have instrumental lessons. I mean, I probably at primary school, there were recorder lessons and things like that, but I always had a very good ear, so I used to cheat, because I just used to memorise whatever anybody did, and I'd get it like that, so I didn't actually have to bother with the dots. So I went through that whole period of my life not reading or writing music, but I reached a point when I wanted to actually write my own music, that it became very clear that because musicians and composers use a code to communicate to each other, notation, that if I didn't have that code, I didn't understand that code and couldn't use it, then effectively it would be very hard for me to write music. And I didn't want to write music that was improvisation or anything like that. I wanted to write stuff that I had kind of a strong degree of control over. Absolutely, yeah. So I had to go through that particular process, yeah.
But I was interested if you were writing notes the wrong way and things like that.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know why that was. It was just ignorance, I suppose. But I used to do them in the medieval way, which is where you kind of have a dot and then the face goes forwards, as opposed to now it goes back. So my quavers all had this kind of slightly medieval look to them, and it was really quite endearing, but not right. So no, I mean, things that I didn't know I made up, and things that I did know I probably got wrong. So between the whole lot, it was a bit of a mess. But nevertheless, the imagination that was driving it forwards was very much intact. It was just I didn't have the means, to express that.
In some respects, do you think the fact you didn't learn the rules, as it were, do you think that's helped you in your composition?
Absolutely. I didn't realise that until some time on, after I did actually start writing music and getting things performed, and people actually started to say that the work I was producing had a very original sound, and where did it come from, and all that sort of thing. It came from ignorance. And I think sometimes when you're taught composition, or you're exposed to a whole range of composers' compositional techniques, it becomes very easy for the creative person to get lost by the weight of history and the weight of influences and the way that this worked. You know, try it, do it yourself, see how it sounds, and you can go through that process, and you have to be a pretty strong character to come out the other end where you're not completely swamped and influenced by everything that's gone before. For me, because I never had that, it meant that I had to, you know, truly invent my own way, and that led to everything that I do around music coming from a basis that is actually not rooted in music per se. It could be rooted in visual art, it could be rooted in geology, it could be rooted in many things about life, but not actually rooted in compositional technique. Although I have to use that to deliver the music, but that wasn't the starting point. Every other art form, if you like, influenced me, and the way I would actually approach creating music, rather than the way that music is written itself. But I must just say that listening to music was a very important part of my informal learning, but I didn't learn how to write music in the notational sense by listening to it, but I did learn an awful lot about how music works as sound on the ears.
And who were you listening to at that time?
I started off, my big passion was for Vaughan Williams and Bax and Holst. I loved the English pastoral music, and I still do. Even though the music I write couldn't be further away from it, I absolutely love it. It's a passion for me. And then starting off in that sort of particular 20th century music, I went the other way and started listening to classical music and Baroque music and early music, which I love greatly, and then slowly delving into contemporary music and discovered composers like Peter Maxwell Davies and Harrison Birtwistle.
Well, that leads you on to your first piece. Tell us your first piece that you ever wrote.
Oh,
how it was taken up, how it...
The I See Blue. Yes, I See Blue was my first orchestral piece and one of my first proper pieces, I think, really possibly like number one of my proper pieces. And I sent it off to what was then the Manchester Composers Platform back in 1994, run by the BBC in Manchester. And it was a hand-written score, which I did in biro, as I did then, and photocopied and sent off, and it was selected by a panel, and it was workshopped by the BBC Philharmonic, and it created a stir, which was fantastic. It was the first time I'd had anything played by more than 2 or 3 amateur musicians, and here was an orchestra of 100 professionals playing it, and the response was hugely positive, so much so that although this was a workshop, it subsequently went on to be broadcast 3 times on BBC Radio 3, and it was conducted by Martin Babbins and later by Peter Maxwell Davies, who conducted the BBC Philharmonic and also took it to the Gewandhaus Radio Orchestra in Leipzig in Germany. So it and me went from nowhere, from complete obscurity, to suddenly having all this...
Did you bypass the natural route, really, to get to having a symphonic piece? Orchestral piece performed?
Yes, I did, and much to some people's dislike as well. I have on my journey encountered a certain amount of jealousy, particularly I think because I didn't earn my stripes in the normal way. I didn't go to this college and have that tutor or whatever. I just suddenly came literally from nowhere into the scene, and there was a buzz and interest around what I was doing, and I was on Radio 3 and I was interviewed, and there were a number of people who resented that, really resented it. And you know, the composition world is a funny place because whilst there are some very successful individuals who are very confident and very generous and open with their colleagues, there are also a great deal of very insecure, mean and spiteful individuals who protect their own territory and will actually be destructive to some other composers.
Well, business, like all creative business,
yeah,
I like that. To go from sort of, you know, nowhere to suddenly having the BBC behind it and Peter Maxwell Davies and an 100-piece orchestra. Did you write very simple pieces after that, thinking you know, I can't write for 200 pieces just because the first one was so a big work. Do I need to pare that down and get back to some your own basics with it, or did you then just move on from that?
I moved on from it. Yeah, there was no. Well, I suppose I was so excited about the possibilities that I then wanted to do more and much more and achieve more and learn more through what I was writing. So I would get better and better and better. So no, the pieces developed from there. They certainly didn't get any easier. And there were more orchestral pieces that came. There were more large chamber pieces, small pieces. I just had to write. It was in my blood to write and write and write and write, and that's remained the same ever since.
Do you think the reason you're still being creative after sort of 20 years and bits or whatever is because you've never had that set of rules and you've never had sort of career plans? So I think people who don't have big plans just sort of set you go, well, I'll create that and then I'll create that and I'll create that, and it feeds itself. That's what happens to me and people I know in my business. Just wondering if that's what happened to you, or
I think up to a point. I mean, the creative drive is obviously a very personal thing, and you've either got it or you haven't, and or there are different levels. For me, it's a burning passion. I can't not do it. So that's always been the driving force for it. My mind tends to think of new things and I want to get them out and get them written down and all the rest of it. So I am driven to do that no matter what.
You also paint as well, and there's a lot of space in your paintings. They're not overcrowded, and space in paintings and space in music. There's a lot of space in what few pieces I know of yours. There's a lot of space in it.
Yes.
It's not crowded out. Too many notes.
You're absolutely right bringing up the painting, because part of what's kept me creative, and that was the original question, how is that still kind of going, is because of the way I feed off visual art, and because I paint myself. So that sounds like I do the body paint, but because I paint, and there's always new stuff to discover in that, and always there's just so many things in life to be inspired by. I think is what keeps me going. And as I mentioned in my talk, fascinations for geology and weather and fractals and chaos theory and all these other things. It's they are strong driving forces, and the pieces you heard today were quite spacious ones, but a lot of the stuff I do is actually densely packed information, verging on chaotic, and I'm fascinated by chaos. I'm fascinated by flux. I'm even more fascinated by taking music and performers to a particular edge of what is possible, because I think you achieve particular things when you go to that edge. I've never been somebody who's interested in being in the middle of somewhere, a nice comfortable place. I want to push boundaries. I want to push my own creativity. I want to push the possibilities, but it all comes down to wanting to create something which for me works, and that's a journey that I go through every day and will go on for the rest of my life. I can't see any burnout coming. I've never had composer's block. I don't know what it is, mercifully, and I know lots of people who do struggle to be creative and have a little burst and then 6 months of nothing. For me, it's like turning a tap on, literally. Stuff is churning in my head. As soon as I've finished something or I'm working on something, the next ideas are formulating, and then given the opportunity, a commission or whatever, then out it comes. That's just the way I'm built, really.
You're then taking it to what some would think was an extreme level in a way, in that you've got this idea of writing pieces for, say, an ensemble, where everybody goes starting point and everybody's got a finishing point, but what happens in between is improvise, for want of a better phrase, but you're not asking them to improvise.
It's not improvised. No. I will explain that, because that there is some confusion sometimes around that sort of principle. I've got to this point in writing music because in the past I've found that when I've been writing particularly chamber music without a conductor, that I have meticulously scored so that everybody is doing things in the same beats. It takes a phenomenal amount of time and practice to get it right, and even then the musicians are under a great deal of stress because it's asking an awful lot. If you've got a conductor putting down a beat, so much easier for everybody to know what's happening time-wise. If there's no conductor, the musicians have to somehow communicate themselves. And if you've got this music that's just going all over the place, it's a nightmare. And I wanted to be able to maintain the level of virtuosity in the music, but at the same time remove the levels of stress within performing the piece. And I didn't want to get a piece that was performed badly because I had written something that was impossible to perform without a conductor. So I wanted to find a compromise that would allow me to push all those limits further. And the logical course for me, and it also coincides with a lot of the things I've been doing in painting recently, is to look at taking away the need for a common beat within musicians. So yes, I call these unsynchronized pieces, and what this means is that each musician has fully notated music, and each of them play through their material, their own time signatures, their own speeds. They all start at the beginning or at various points or whatever, doesn't really matter, but they are playing independently but together. And I look at these pieces before I compose them to try and work out what the possibilities are, where this kind of fluctuations and flexibility can happen. But what it means is you're going to have, let's say, 7 or 8 musicians who are all working through their part as if they were playing a solo. But there are 7 soloists all playing together. And all this sound interweaves in and out in a highly virtuosic way, in a very fluid way. And because the players are only contending with the technique of playing and the expression of playing, and not where they are in relation to everybody else, there's a liberation that comes through that performance that makes it more human in a way and less stressed. So the virtuosity level actually increases because they're not tempered by the need to know what everybody else is doing. And what you get is a kind of a cacophonous chaos that is both beautiful, alarming, frightening, mad, all these different things, and where the form of the music tends to evolve as it moves through in a very natural way, which interests me, and where no two performances are exactly the same. So it's bringing degrees of freedom that are not improvisational at all, fully notated, but they're bringing a flexibility in the way the musicians relate to each other. And it's very, very exciting, and the first batch of these pieces, which are called the Shape Distance, the same name that has been given to a series of 8 paintings I've recently done, is going to be performed in Atlanta in the US with Chamber Cartel in September. I'm hoping to go over for that. And that will be the first time my theoretical research into how these compositions will work will be tried out with real people. So it's very exciting for me.
But there's no score in the traditional sense.
No score in the traditional.
You can't look at overall score and say, oh yeah, that's what he's going to be playing when I'm playing this.
Absolutely
When
not.
there's no conductor. So do you feel there's going to be a need for a lead musician who sort of takes it through? Or?
In those pieces, no. There's no need for a lead musician. Each player has all the instructions they need within their music. There is no score because a score is largely about presenting the material that's in the music in a vertical alignment so you can see what a number of instruments are doing at any given time. The most traditional use is where everything is barred, so you can see exactly, and someone can look at say, oh, in bar 29, I'm playing this, you're playing that, and so-and-so's playing that. There's none of that going on with what I'm doing because the relationships between all the musicians vertically is so flexible that there is no one way of saying this is right, this is exactly right. It's always right, but it's always flexible. It's not right if one of them's playing half an hour later than they should do, but we're talking about seconds here in the way that these interrelationships will change.
Well, what are the duration of these pieces, do you think?
Well, these pieces will be about 12 minutes long.
So it's manageable?
It's manageable. It can be a lot longer. I've done a string quartet like that that's 18 minutes. So it's not by any means... The length isn't the issue because musicians will try as hard as they can to play at the speeds that you have notated for them to play at. And so long as you have calculated what is humanly possible to do, they will strive their hardest to get to that point. So you have violin 1, whose material, if it was played as a solo, may last 12 minutes, violin 2 may last 11 minutes, violin 3 may last 13 minutes. So that means that if they're all playing roughly the right speeds, violin 3 will be the last to finish, violin 2 will be the first to finish. So you can calculate by how long you extend things what's going to kind of emerge from that unsynchronized playing. So it's all about how long the bits are. And of course you can play with that in any number of ways you want. You can have it in blocks, you can have it petering off, you can go into another block of music, you can have people cueing different instruments whilst they're playing. And if the clarinet's playing along and then in his bar 35 it says cue the vibraphone, then you cue the vibraphone and the vibraphone starts. You don't need a conductor to do that sort of thing. It just kind of organically evolves as it goes along. But the music, all these different parts are all related. The material is all related. It's like distant variations that are all brought together. So there is a consistency in the sound world. It's not any old nonsense going on. All the parts are related and carefully crafted to sort of create a cohesive whole.
Yeah, and they'll be playing in a similar tone and similar mood for them, for a better phrase, won't they?
Yes, I mean...
They're not composed to be competing against each other.
The kind of way that they work with each other will change moment by moment, depending on who's playing loudly, who's playing quietly, who's playing fast, soft, whether they're high or low, how many of them are playing, whether there's 3 bars the rest of that point. The textures change completely as the music is evolving, so there's a lot of contrast in it. They all shine, they all go into the background, they all do different things at different times, but it's like a sort of shape that's going like this and another one that's doing that and another one. So there are always things that come to the fore, and part of what makes this music so colourful is the ebb and flow of the parts. The players have their dynamics, so if they're told to play loud or reasonably loud or quiet, they follow those instructions. But there could be 3 of them that are currently in a part that's relatively quiet, while another one's told to be loud. So, you know, they come to the fore in that way, and it's a natural kind of flow between the different voices.
Audiences would think that's never going to work. You know, we just explained it to a guy in a bar.
Yeah.
And some musicians would think, oh, is that going to, same question, is that going to work? But what you said in your talk is that you've got musicians coming to you now, wanting to approach music in that way.
Yes, absolutely, because it's not something that is commonly done. You know, there are passages in pieces of music where there are unsynchronized things going on. I mean, composers like Lutoslawski did loads of that sort of thing. You know, there's all that sort of stuff, but it's
not Stockhausen. It's not.
Well, I mean, Stockhausen did all sorts of things, ranging from lunacy down to goodness knows what. But I mean, he explored. You know, it's not that bringing instruments together like this is a new thing to do. It's happened before, but it's my thing. All of my recent pieces are like that, and it's done to a particular extreme. So in that sense, it is different. It's taking that idea of unsynchronized playing whilst having stuff completely notated. Many composers use aleatoric writing, which is where you kind of put sort of blobs or squiggles and things, and you just kind of do your stuff around it, or little boxes of stuff where you repeat it over and over for 5 seconds and then you change to the next box. Mine is rather more through composed. So I think that's the difference, that you could take any one part from one of my pieces and play it as a solo, because it's written as a solo.
Well, that's the difference between a lot of works of trying to do that stuff. So
it means the level of virtuosity is always very, very high, and the level of detail in all the writing is always high. There are aspects of that kind of playing that happen in jazz, but then jazz can be very formalised as well, and you know, you've probably always got something dum 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 dum.
Or there might be people playing a particular pattern while the lead trumpet plays is improvising through the whole piece.
I mean,
it's a mixture.
A lot of jazz actually has far more organisation than people very often realise.
Well, it's usually riding on the drum and the bass.
Well, you've got a pulse going through.
Yeah.
I mean, free contemporary jazz can be absolutely off the wall, and in some ways it's kind of closer to the aesthetics of that, except in that form of jazz, players are improvising. I always take the view that I'm a composer, and I want to write the music, and I want to have that music to tell the players what to do. I'm not interested in improvisation. Other composers are, that's absolutely fine. But to me, if I was going to take the analogy somewhere else, it's like me doing a bit of painting and then saying to somebody else, oh, you fill in those bits, there we are, that's finished, that's the painting, that's my work. But it's not my work. I collaborate with musicians via their performance, but I don't collaborate from the point of view that I expect them to make up the music. They've got enough to do. Perhaps I'm a bit of a control freak, but they're not so much of a control freak, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this unsynchronised stuff.
I was going to say, how are you letting your works go anyway? You know, once you compose them, you let them go out there, but after you've been to the premiere or you've seen a few performances, are you quite happy for them to be performed in God knows where, without really knowing how they've approached it? Does that bother you?
No, I mean, not really. I try to give as much information in the score to help the musicians as possible. I'm always contactable if there are questions. Most of the time, people contact me and say, oh, I found this music of yours, or such, I'd like to perform it. And then if they have an issue, a problem, question, I get an email. So it's not so often actually anything happens in total isolation. There's usually some form of communication. But I'm thrilled if a piece takes on its own life and goes out there. And if somebody makes a mess of it, well, so what? You know, that's life. There are other people who do it really well. Being played is what's important.
Well, I think there are a lot of people in different art forms that some people think there's a level of perfection. I think that's bunkum. It can't be. It's like Charlie Chaplin once did 105 takes on just opening a door. Well, you've lost the plot. If you need 105 takes, you've just lost it.
Well, I think
Because the piece is always going to move, isn't it? Even if it's 10 seconds,
absolutely.
Depending on who the performer is.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole concept of perfection I find rather boring, to be honest. When I look at the way, in my very ignorantly informed manner of how the universe works, it is not based on perfection, it's based on imperfection. And it's imperfection that generates the resonance for destruction and recreation. Everything is in a state of being made, and you know, perfection is almost a state of stasis. It's a self-contained thing. Nature is falling apart and rebuilding and falling apart. There's catastrophe, and then there's great beauty. I mean, it's not about perfection. And who's perfection anyway? What is perfection?
But also, if somebody performed a piece and that was perfection, there's no point playing it again.
Well, exactly. If you reach the pinnacle, there's nothing to strive for. And with regards to writing a piece of music, I can't imagine anybody starting out to write a piece of music that is perfection. There may be, you know, there are people that look back on the work of Bach, for instance, and say it is perfect music, and that may be the case. But I'm really not interested in that as a concept or an ambition. I want to do the best I can at that point in time.
Well, that's what Bach was doing. He wasn't sitting there saying this is perfect.
Of course not.
He was just saying, I'm going to try and write the best piece I can.
Yeah, yes, and that's all you can do. I think composers who are concerned with perfection end up usually writing very little, because it becomes a very self-destructive trap, because it is ultimately unobtainable. And as I say, what is perfection in music? It comes down to a personal aesthetic, a taste. You know, some people may think Mozart is perfection. Other people think Brahms is perfection. Other people think Brahms is rotten old stodge. You know, it's perhaps a state of perfection that exists in some kind of abstraction of mathematics. But for the rest of us in our daily lives and the great world out there, forget it. You know, it's not going to happen.
Standard approach to when you're actually thinking you've got an idea for a piece, how do you know to approach that?
Well, everything starts off in my head, but it can start off at any time, really. It usually starts off when I'm writing a piece. The next piece starts off. I mean, it helps if I know who I'm going to be writing for. I mean, for instance, I've got a piece that I'm writing for a strange combination of double bass and piano. So I've got to think really carefully about how to handle that, because you've got a basically very quiet low instrument and a very loud extrovert instrument, how to bring those together. But the ideas kind of formulate in my head whilst I'm doing all sorts of things. Cooking is a good one. Walking is an obvious. I go running, I go walking. If my body is kind of involved in something, then my brain tends to formulate all sorts of stuff. And I find those periods very, very productive. I can come up with all the kind of material and ideas I need to get sort of started. It's not an issue for me. Luckily, I don't have to struggle with these things. And there is certainly none of that kind of romantic notion. Oh, I must suffer, I'm an artist, I must suffer. I suffer for my art, I suffer for my music. I don't suffer at all, I'm afraid to say. I mean, to say I find it easy makes light of it, because it's very intensive mental work. But I don't have issues about it. For me, thinking musically or thinking visually about pictures and things is very natural. Let's put it in those terms. It's a very, very natural thing. It's the same as breathing or feeling hungry or whatever else. It just comes upon me.
So you write quickly as well. You don't
ferociously quickly.
You don't spend hours just to get what the equivalent of 20 bars is. Say.
No, it's no. I mean, there are sometimes tricky corners in things. Sometimes there are tricky corners, and they will take more work than the previous 10 minutes for 5 seconds. Other times it's kind of straight through. But as far as speeds of writing go, I would say I'm on the very fast side. And the music is complex and multi-layered. It's not like I'm writing semi-briefs, pages of semi-briefs. Oh look, I've got a 40-minute piece and there's only 10 notes in it. It's not that kind of thing. It's not minimalist music. It's maximalist music, full of notes and colour and all sorts of stuff. So you look at these scores, or you hear the music, and you would probably think it took a lot longer to write than it actually does for me. But that's just because the connection of my mind through my technique to the page and the musicians is a very fast one, and I'm lucky for that.
Do you revise them much, or does the shape change much in the piece as you're writing, or do you like to get them down in one session, as it were, and then revise them over a few weeks?
Ultimately, I like the approach of the big blat. I like to get the landscape, the geography of something out there and done, and then fiddle with the details. I'm not interested in fiddling in details and losing the bigger picture. The process is generally quite fast, but as I was saying previously about paintings, when I start off a piece, I have no idea about what it's going to be, and I consciously really don't structure. I'll have ideas, and I've mentioned ideas, but these ideas are not, this is the beginning, this is the middle, this is the end ideas. They are just ideas, they sit. And when I come to work with a piece, I will throw all this stuff out. Quite often, and for some strange reason, it will come out fairly sequentially. But it might not start at the beginning of the piece, because as I'm working through whatever I'm working through, I might get so far down, and there might be a bit which is, actually, this is the beginning, and this needs to go over here. So there's a certain amount of juggling.
You're like screenwriting in a way, that's how
yeah, there's a sort of cut and pasting idea of that piece of music belongs better there. But you can only do that when you've got an overview of the geography and you've stood back from it. Revisions don't happen very often, and they will only happen if I've miscalculated something about a particular technique that doesn't work. I do as much research as I can about instruments and their capabilities. I don't know everything, and I don't know everything about every instrument. So sometimes I will get something wrong. And if there is a particular thing that I've got wrong, I will go back and retrospectively edit it. I don't very often edit and revise the music as a whole package. Has happened on occasions, but it's an unusual thing. And so far with the pieces I've been writing in recent years, I don't think I've felt the need to revise anything like that, because I think for that time when I was writing it, I got it as good as I can.
So you're tinkering a bit, really, in what some would call a revision.
Yeah, there would be some minor tinkering if necessary. I like it when I can write a piece and I don't need to do anything to it, and I'm happy, and the musicians are happy, and that's it, and it goes out into the world. But of course, the perspective of time changes things. You may think 10 years on, looking back at something, that it's not quite as good as it could be because you've learnt something better in the meantime. You then have a choice: do you go back and do you change that? Do you not? I tend to work from the opinion that what you write at a particular point in your life is what you write. If you constantly go back to revise things, you seldom move forwards. No, the momentum must be forwards, and you bring the learning from the past into the present. But if you're trying to make, I suppose it goes back to this perfection thing, if you're trying to make something perfect as a continual obsession, it's not for me.
And also it's pointless going back to an old work to think, well, I can make that particular piece that's 20 bars better or whatever. You might as well put that idea, whatever it is, into a new work and then build something around that.
Well, I think so, because, I mean, apart from anything else, it's very hard to take yourself back to the mindset and to be the person that you were, assuming you've evolved in some way, to that point in time, and put yourself in those shoes. Because then what can happen is you get something which is somewhat out of context, because you've kind of transplanted new learning into an old scenario, but the rest of the scenario is still old. You know, it can be messy. I mean, I would say don't do it unless the piece actually needs surgery. You know, if you need major surgery, you need to cut off an arm and a leg here or there and stitch it up because it will work, and before it didn't work, that's fine. But if we're talking about some kind of obsession with getting it perfect, then I think that can just be a bad idea. It's not, you know, other people do it, perhaps not for me.
There's one more. What we'd say to a teenager who came up to you, say, I want to get involved in music, would you advise them to study or just to do what you did and just go for it?
Ooh, that's a really tricky one.
I suppose it depends on their capabilities and whether they play an instrument or not.
I mean, I think the route that I went down is a very difficult one, and for my personality it worked because I'm a self-confident person, which I think also helps, and I've kind of got the bravado to get up there and make things happen. Other people haven't got that, and I think it can be a very isolating and unproductive route. Going to have formalised music training, well, pros and cons. There are some people that thrive in that. There are others who are obliterated by their tutors and mentors. Again, because unfortunately, not all the people that teach in music colleges should be teaching, and some of them are very frustrated people who wreak havoc on talent because of jealousy. And I don't want to say, please, you know, that is not what happens in every case, but it does happen. And I know composers whose confidence has been ripped apart because of the appalling teaching and mentorship of people who they're supposed to be in their care of. There are others who've flourished and learnt fantastic things. So there is no set answer. But let's turn it round and say that I don't think that it does any harm if you have the confidence and you can teach yourself and learn and progress, then not going down that route is a possibility. It's certainly not something not to consider. But a lot can be gained from a formal academic training. Who knows? Depends where you go, who you study with, what you like, what level of talent you have.
But even if you go the formalised way, say with filmmaking, the thing is you learn the rules, but then you break them.
Well, yeah, that's the theory. That's the theory. And if you get composers who can do that, who are independently spirited, who can make their mark, who can find their voice, then fabulous. What happens to the great majority is that you have this rather mediocre pool of undaring, unadventurous, uninspiring people who are technically facilitated, but artistically not very interesting. They can do, you know, they can do the stuff because they've learnt a lot of stuff. They're fastidious with their technique, but the music, the art, is not really very, very exciting. You can get somebody else, and I prefer you get somebody else who actually has a more feeble technique, but my God, there's something in the music. It may be rough and ready, but they've got something to say, and they're saying it their way. You know, Frank Sinatra, but that's worth something. Whereas just being kind of meticulously good at technique and having no imagination, or cribbing and copying from every other composer you can possibly think of.
So you've got to finish it as pastiche.
Yeah, and there's there's so much pastiche about, and unfortunately a lot of the composers who deal with pastiche actually think they're really good and original.